Safety risk assessment.
We have learned in our previous module that risk is an outcome or consequence of a hazard. The next step is to assess the probability and severity of the risk outcome of the hazard, taking into account the worst-case scenario.
What is risk severity and risk probability, Professor?
Well, let me try and explain it with a simple example. Let us assume that a pothole has been reported on the secondary runway that is used only for emergencies. The pothole is not in the center, but a little to the left of the yellow markings. Once this hazard has been identified, the risk outcome is then assessed, commencing with the assessment of severity. The worst-case scenario is that the airport is forced to use the secondary runway due to some emergency, and an aircraft drifts from the center line and the landing gear collapses upon impact with the pothole. The severity is extreme because such an accident is likely to cause severe damage and loss of life. In the aviation industry, we have a 5-point scale to measure the severity of a risk. At the highest level is 5, which is catastrophic. This means that there is equipment destroyed, human lives lost, and monetary damage is in excess of $500 million. 4 is hazardous, where there is damage to the extent of $100 million, deaths and equipment damage. 3 is major, where there is serious injury to people, damage to equipment, and losses to the tune of $50 million. 2 is minor, where the use of emergency procedures curtail the damage to $1 million. And finally, 1, which is negligible, where there were no major consequences and damage was about $100,000.
That was a great example, Professor. Now that we have understood risk severity, would you please explain risk probability?
Well, Professor, safety risk probability is the likelihood that an unsafe event or condition might occur. For example, what is the probability of bad weather, the probability of engine failure, or the probability of an accident? Like risk severity, risk probability also has a 5-point scale on which probability of occurrence is measured in aviation. 5. Frequent, which is an incident that has happened on every flight and is therefore likely to happen again. 4. Occasional, which is for something that has happened infrequently, once in 1,000 flights, and is therefore likely to occur infrequently. 3. Remote, which is an event that may occur, but it is unlikely. It has occurred only once in 100,000 flights. 2. Improbable, which is an event that has occurred once in 1,000,000 flights and is very unlikely to occur. 1 represents extremely improbable, as the event may have been known to occur once in 1,000,000,000 flights, and it is almost inconceivable that it might occur. Based on the risk severity and risk probability, we can calculate the risk tolerability.
To understand risk tolerability better, let's take a look at this table. On one side is the probability scale, and on the other side is severity scale. Risk tolerability is arrived at by a simple multiplication of the probability and severity to arrive at risk value factor, where 25 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. The AKO has suggested that any risk has to be assessed in the context of such a grid and action taken accordingly. The green areas in this grid denote that no action needs to be taken. The yellow areas indicate that the risk is not acceptable level and action needs to be taken to lower this rating. The red areas indicate unacceptable level of risk. Let us take a look at this grid along with a couple of examples. Let us say that there is a tire pressure gauge that is not calibrated properly. The risk is that the personnel will not be able to gauge tire pressure correctly and the tire might burst, resulting in death. Since there is no data at this point in time, let us assume that the probability of this happening is remote with a risk value of 3, but the results would be catastrophic, which carries a value of 5. The severity of risk is therefore in the red zone, which means action needs to be taken.
The action that would be taken is that the uncalibrated gauge is not used. The risk value factor comes down to 5 and into the yellow zone. To sum up the risk tolerability fundamental, if the safety risk of the consequences of the hazard is unacceptable, the organization must allocate resources to reduce the exposure to the consequence of the hazards, Allocate resources to reduce the magnitude or the damaging potential of the consequences of the hazards. Or cancel the operation if mitigation is not possible.
We all know that to allocate any resource which would help us in reducing the exposure or the magnitude of the hazard will involve the allocation of funds. Which brings us to the next fundamental, which is cost-benefit analysis.
To understand cost-benefit analysis better, let us take a look at the same example that we saw earlier about the pothole on the secondary runway. A comparison would be done between the cost of filling the pothole versus the cost of loss of life and property if an aircraft had to crash because of the pothole. It would be assessed that the cost of filling the pothole was negligible compared to the cost of damage in case of an accident.
This would have been an easy decision, Professor, but the choices are not always so simple because the costs are not always directly measurable and the indirect costs are substantial. Let us say an accident does occur, then the direct cost would be the cost of repairing the aircraft. However, the indirect costs would be several. The cost of cancelled flight, cost of loss of business due to one less aircraft in the fleet, cost of loss of productivity, cost of human time taken to repair the aircraft, cost of investigating the incident, cost of standard insurance deduction on any claim, possible cost of legal action or claims due to cancellation of flight penalties and citations.
That is a long list of indirect costs. Apart from the monetary factors, there are several subjective factors that also come into play while making the cost-benefit analysis.
That is right, Professor. The first is the managerial factor. Is the safety risk consistent with the organization's safety policy and objectives? Legal factor. Is the safety risk in conformance with current regulatory standards and enforcement capabilities? Cultural factor. How will the organization's personnel and other stakeholders view the safety risk? Market factors. Will the organization's competitiveness and well-being vis-à-vis other organizations be compromised by the safety risk? Political factors. Will there be a political price to pay for not addressing the safety risk? And finally, public factor. How influential will the media or special interest groups be in affecting public opinion regarding the safety risk? Those are the 6 factors that any aviation company takes into account before accepting or rejecting any risk factor based on a cost-benefit analysis.
Now that we have understood the risk severity, probability, and have a better understanding of direct and indirect costs whilst doing a cost-benefit analysis, let's take a look at the final fundamental, which is risk control or mitigation. This can be done in 4 ways: avoidance, reduction, segregation of exposure, and insuring against risk. Let us take an example of avoidance. In case there is snowfall and the weather forecast predicts a snowstorm, you decide that your flights will not take off. This completely does away with the risk of an accident. Using the same example, let us see how the risk can be reduced. Remember, airlines make money as long as their aircraft fly. The operator might take the decision to take off, but use a longer route to go around the storm. This reduces the risk of an accident. The third way is segregating exposure or simply not putting all your eggs in one basket. In this case, if there is a weather forecast of a snowstorm, the operator takes proactive action by not parking all its aircraft in that airport. This means that even in the case of a storm, flights can still take off from other stations. Finally, the last risk control measure is insurance or transfer of risk. An important point to remember in insurance is that by this, we only transfer the economic consequences of an event, but do not control the risk of the event. With this, we come to an end of our 9th and final module on safety management systems, where we have learned what is risk assessment, the cost-benefit analysis for assessing risk, the calculation of risk probability, risk severity, how to calculate risk tolerance and take action accordingly, and how to control or manage risk. Thank you.